I want to talk to you guys about how Sudan is a point of contention between the Arabs and the Turks, and also the Turks and the Russians. The Arabs and the Turks are historical enemies. The Turks used to have the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire ruled over the Arabs. The Arabs, with the help of the British, fought against the Ottoman Empire for independence and defeated the Turks. The Turks have never forgotten this, and they have never let go of this fact. And they still want to enact vengeance on the Arabs. The Iranians hate the Arabs for obvious reasons. Saudi Arabia is the spiritual head of the Sunni world because that is where the Kaaba is, the holiest site of Islam. The Iranians are Shia. Again, this is not the only reason as to why the Iranians hate the Arabs, but it's definitely amongst the reasons. The Iranians are Shia, they hate the Sunni, and so they want to destroy Saudi Arabia. That's amongst the reasons. Let's also not forget that the Arabs invaded Iran back in the early days of Islam and committed a horrific massacre of the Iranians, literally creating a pool of blood. So there is a long history of bloodshed and a very long history of hatred and violence. The Arabs noticed that Sudan was an ally to Iran and Turkey. This was when Sudan was ruled by Omar al-Bashir. Omar al-Bashir was a genocidal leader. He was a genocidal dictator. I used to talk a lot about Omar al-Bashir. This was back in the 2010s when I first really started seriously blogging and writing. And the reason why I talked a lot about Omar al-Bashir was because he was responsible for the killing of around 2 million people. So Omar al-Bashir is a genocidal, murderous individual. Omar al-Bashir was an ally to Turkey and Iran. And for this reason, the Arabs were terrified of this alliance. They wanted to pull Sudan away from Turkey's sphere and Iran's sphere and bring the country into the axis of the Arab world, of Saudi Arabia and of the UAE. So Sudan was in a very difficult situation because Sudan lost South Sudan. There was a civil war between Muslims and Christians. The Christians were in the south, the Muslims in the north. And the Christians were fighting for their independence for understandable reasons, given the fact that Omar al-Bashir was genociding Christians, slaughtering Christians. And so the Christians won the civil war and they won their independence. South Sudan became an independent country back in 2011. And with South Sudan leaving North Sudan, South Sudan also took most of the oil. So Khartoum, which is the capital of Sudan, lost most of its oil, and that was a huge hit on its economy. The Arabs took notice of this, and they said, well, listen, economically you're suffering. You've lost most of your oil, but we can help you. And so Saudi Arabia and the UAE told Bashir to sever ties with Turkey and Iran, and Omar al-Bashir complied. He cut ties with Turkey, he cut ties with Iran, and in exchange, he received billions of dollars in investments from the UAE and Saudi Arabia. There was also a crisis between Saudi Arabia and the UAE on one side and Qatar on the other, supposedly because Qatar was supporting Islamic terrorism and the Saudis and the Emiratis wanted to pressure Qatar to stop doing this. There was this rivalry between the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris, and so they began to pressure the Sudanese government to go against Qatar, to not be friends with Qatar, and to remove Islamists from its government. So the Emiratis and the Saudis wanted North Sudan. They wanted the Sudan of Omar al-Bashir. They wanted Omar al-Bashir to remove the Islamist officials within his government. And this was very difficult because Omar al-Bashir he was quite aware of the fact that there were people in his government who wanted him removed, and he did not want to rock the boat. He didn't want to piss off the Islamists in his government, and so he tried his best to please both sides. He began to work to please the Emiratis and the Saudis, and he was friendly with the Qataris, and he got a lot of money from Qatar. He also was getting aid from the UAE, but the UAE took notice. They took notice, well, Omar al-Bashir is still friendly with the Qataris. So the Saudis and the UAE, the Emiratis, they concluded that Omar al-Bashir could not be trusted, that he could not be trusted. And eventually what happened was that there was a meeting in Egypt. Sudanese military and intelligence officials who hated Omar al-Bashir had a meeting in Cairo with officials from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And together, the Egyptian officials, Sudanese officials, and Arab and Emirati officials, together they conspired to have Omar al-Bashir ousted. And so they began to work with some heavy hitters in Sudan's military apparatus. They began to work with Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. They also began to work with the major paramilitary branch of Sudan's military, the Rapid Support Forces, better known as its acronym, the RSF, led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known by his nickname Hemedti, which sounds like something out of ancient Egypt. And so they conspired to overthrow Omar al-Bashir, and that's exactly what happened. So now the Arabs have been backing the military government of al-Burhan, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and also the RSF. The UAE has been backing the RSF. The Saudis have been backing al-Burhan. Remember, the Arabs had a war with Iran's proxies in Yemen, the Houthis. The Saudis went to al-Burhan and they said, we're going to help Sudan, we're going to invest in Sudan, but you have to help us fight Iran's proxies. Remember, the Saudis hate the Iranians. They are afraid of Sudan entering the sphere of influence of Iran. They don't want that. So they want to make sure that they have Sudan on their side. So they want to make sure that Sudan remains one of their guys. And they don't want Iran in Sudan because Iran is Shia. Iran is the head of the Shiite world, and they hate the Arabs, and the Arabs hate them. It's very simple. You don't have to go to university to learn geopolitics to understand this. It's all very simple. I find it very silly when people say things like, the situation in the Middle East is extremely complicated. No, it's not. One side hates the other because thousands of years ago, or 1,000 years ago, some guy killed the sons of the prophet, and so they've been hating each other ever since. It really is that simple. They want territory, they want resources, etc. There's nothing complicated about this. And so the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, and the Sudanese military of Abdel Fattah al-Burhan sent fighters to Yemen to fight the Houthis. And the Arabs, in exchange, have been supporting Sudan, investing in Sudan, putting billions of dollars in Sudan. And also, it's very interesting. A lot of gold has been going into the UAE. Gold from where? Gold from Sudan. And the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, they are extremely wealthy. They are extremely well funded. How are they getting so much money? All of the gold mines in Sudan. So if you're wondering what's one of the interests of the Arabs, it's not just making sure that Sudan remains within the sphere of influence of the Arabs and not the Turks and the Iranians. It's also because of lots of gold. There's a tremendous amount of gold in Sudan. A lot of wealth, a lot of money to be made. Turkey also has strong interest in Sudan. Remember, the Ottomans used to rule over Sudan. So the Turks, wanting to go back to their glory days, they want to bring countries that were once under Ottoman rule into Turkey's sphere of influence. It really is that simple. It's like Russia wanting to take Ukraine. Why? Because Ukraine historically, traditionally, has been within Russia's sphere of influence. NATO wants to pull Ukraine into its sphere of influence. Russia doesn't want this. It's very, very simple. It's not complicated at all. The Russians say, no, Ukraine belongs to us. NATO has these Nazis. They're arming and training these Nazis in Ukraine. We can't allow that. And NATO is saying, no, Ukraine is one of our guys. We're going to back them. We're going to invest in Ukraine. We're going to arm Ukraine. We're going to train Ukraine. We're going to do all these things in Ukraine to make sure that Ukraine is ours. Why? Because, well, it's geopolitically very important, because Ukraine is rich in resources, natural gas, very, very important. Same thing goes with Azerbaijan and Armenia. The Russians say, Armenia is one of our guys. NATO says, no, Azerbaijan is our guys. Armenia is an ally to Iran. The Israelis come out and say, we're going to back the Azeris against the Armenians. It doesn't matter if Armenia suffered a Holocaust like we did. Who cares? The Holocaust, well, we'll only bring that up if it's to our interest. But if it's not advantageous to us, we're not going to even bring it up. Who cares? Armenia is an ally to Iran, and we can't allow that, so we have to screw the Armenians using the Azeris. It's not that complicated. So the Turks also want Sudan to be within their sphere of influence, and that's why the Turks for years have been wanting to build a military base on the Red Sea coast of Sudan. The Arabs want to make sure, and this is really the main reason why Saudi Arabia and the UAE want to make sure, they want to maintain Sudan within their sphere of influence, it's because Sudan is right on the Red Sea, right across from Saudi Arabia. And if you control Sudan, you can enter Saudi Arabia. You can invade Saudi Arabia and massacre the Arabs. You can have a Nanking in Saudi Arabia. And that's what the Iranians want to do. That's what the Turks want to do. They want to have that access to invade Saudi Arabia. That's why the Arabs are so terrified of somebody, one of their enemies, controlling Sudan. They're right across from the Red Sea. If Turkey controls Sudan, it'll have access right to Mecca. And that's, being the leading Islamic country militarily, that would be extremely advantageous to Turkey for obvious reasons. It'll have serious spiritual leverage in the Islamic world. It can access Mecca directly. And the fact that the Arabs are hated by the Turks for historical reasons, because of what happened back in World War I and other reasons as well, the Arabs are absolutely petrified of a powerful Turkey right across from its coast. And so the Turks for years have been wanting to build a military base on the Red Sea. Who else wants to have a military base on the Red Sea coast of Sudan? Russia does. And the Russians made an agreement with the Sudanese to have a naval base on the Red Sea coast of Sudan. Who did that piss off? Obviously, the Americans. And the Americans told the Sudanese, don't do it. Sudan didn't listen. America put billions of dollars of aid into Sudan's economy, but that still didn't convince the Sudanese to acquiesce to American demands. And not too long after that, boom, a civil war. So it makes you wonder how this whole thing started. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.